Normal life rarely announces when it is about to end. It slips away quietly in the space between school drop-offs and grocery lists, between text messages that go unanswered and routines that are suddenly altered without explanation. In the case of Lori Vallow, the collapse of normalcy did not arrive with sirens or police tape. It arrived dressed as spiritual awakening, personal reinvention, and a promise spoken softly but believed fiercely that something extraordinary was coming. Before the headlines, before the missing children posters, Lori Vallow appeared to many as an attentive mother. Friends and family described her as cheerful, devout, and deeply invested in her children. Tylee Ryan, her teenage daughter, was known as protective and perceptive beyond her years. J.J. Vallow, her adopted son, was 7 years old, small for his age, and living with autism. He required structure, patience, and consistency, things that, for a time, Lori provided. Their days were ordinary in the way family life usually is: school schedules, doctor's appointments, sibling arguments, and fleeting moments of calm. But ordinary life was no longer enough for Lori. Long before the children vanished, she had begun to change. Her religious interests deepened and narrowed at the same time, drifting away from mainstream beliefs toward a small, intense world of prophecy, visions, and imminent catastrophe. She immersed herself in online forums and gatherings centered on the idea that the end of the world was near and that a chosen few would survive it. This belief did not isolate her immediately. It energized her. She spoke with conviction, certainty, and a sense of importance that made her feel seen and purposeful. It was through these circles that Lori encountered Chad Daybell, a self-published author and speaker who claimed spiritual insight into the unseen world. Chad wrote about near-death experiences, multiple probations of the soul, and a looming apocalypse. He spoke calmly, almost gently, about darkness inhabiting people, about spirits that could be displaced, and about the duty of the righteous to prepare. To some, his ideas were fringe, but harmless. To Lori, they felt like answers. As Lori's attachment to these beliefs strengthened, her ties to everyday reality weakened. Friends noticed that her language shifted. She spoke less about school projects and more about spiritual rankings. She began categorizing people as either aligned with light or overtaken by darkness. These labels were not metaphors to her. They were diagnostics, and once assigned, they were difficult to undo. The first cracks appeared in how she spoke about those closest to her. Her marriage was unraveling, and conflict with family members intensified. Tylee, old enough to question what she was hearing, became increasingly withdrawn. JJ, sensitive to emotional changes, struggled as his routines were disrupted. Lori's focus was no longer on stability. It was on preparation. She talked about moving, about leaving things behind, about a future that did not require explaining itself to outsiders. By the fall of 2019, the children began to slip from public view. Tylee was last seen in September during a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. There was nothing outwardly alarming in the moment: tourists, photos, a normal day, but it would later become unbearable to revisit. After that trip, no one outside Lori's inner circle saw Tylee again. When asked about her daughter, Lori offered vague explanations. Tylee was staying with friends. Tylee was away at college. Tylee did not want to be contacted. Each version was delivered without hesitation, as if the details were unimportant. JJ disappeared shortly afterward. His grandparents, who were actively involved in his life, grew concerned when they could no longer reach him. They had spoken to him, frequently helped manage his care, and were attuned to his needs. Silence was not normal. When they pressed Lori for answers, she insisted JJ was fine. He was with a friend. He was being looked after. Her tone suggested annoyance rather than worry, a response that felt wrong to those who knew how much attention JJ required. What made this phase especially disturbing was the calm. There was no visible panic, no frantic searching, no social media pleas. Lori moved forward with her life. She relocated to Idaho. She married Chad Daybell, just weeks after his wife died, suddenly in her sleep, a death later deemed suspicious. Lori smiled in wedding photos, dressed in white on a beach in Hawaii, while her children were nowhere to be found. To those watching from the outside, the dissonance was staggering. Family members tried to raise alarms, but they were met with deflection and delay. Law enforcement requests were answered with half-truths. Welfare checks were complicated by jurisdictional boundaries, and Lori's confidence that she could talk her way through any question. She presented herself as cooperative while providing no real proof that the children were safe. Each interaction bought her time. Behind the scenes, Lori's belief system was no longer abstract. It was operational. She and Chad spoke openly to each other and to select followers about people whose spirits had turned dark, about individuals who were no longer who they appeared to be. The language was chilling not because it was loud, but because it was methodical. Once someone was labeled, their fate seemed sealed within the logic of the doctrine. Tylee and JJ were not discussed publicly as children in danger. They were discussed privately as problems already solved. As weeks turned into months, the absence of the children became impossible to ignore. Their schools had no records of transfers. No medical appointments were scheduled. No photographs surfaced. Lori continued to offer explanations, but they grew thinner with repetition. The people who loved Tylee and JJ were left in a state of suspended grief, unsure whether to hope or prepare for the worst. This was the moment when normal life fully disappeared, not only for the children, but for everyone connected to them. The realization crept in slowly. Then all at once, something irreversible had already happened. The question was no longer where the children were. It was how long the truth had been buried, and how far belief had been allowed to override the most basic human obligation to protect one's own. The story at this stage still lacked a crime scene. There were no bodies, no confessions, no finality, just two missing children, a mother who refused to act like one, and a belief system that seemed to have erased the line between faith and permission. For those watching closely, the unease was not just about disappearance. It was about the terrifying possibility that in Lori Vallow's world, the children were not lost. They were no longer considered necessary. What replaced the missing children was not grief, not even silence, but a doctrine that filled every gap where doubt might have entered. Chad Daybell did not arrive in Lori Vallow's life as a sudden disruption. He arrived as an explanation. He spoke in the language of order rankings, percentages, spiritual categories, offering a framework that promised clarity in a world Lori increasingly experienced as chaotic and obstructive. His calm delivery masked the extremity of what he was saying. Nothing sounded urgent or violent. Everything sounded inevitable. Chad believed the world was approaching an apocalyptic turning point, and that only a small number of chosen individuals would survive to rebuild it. Within that belief system, people were not simply good or bad. They were assessed, measured, and labeled. Some were light, aligned with God's purpose. Others were dark, their bodies supposedly occupied by corrupt spirits. Those deemed dark were no longer treated as fully human. They were described as empty vessels, what Chad and Lori called zombies. This concept mattered because it removed moral friction. A zombie, in their logic, was already gone. The person's soul had departed, replaced by something malignant. Ending that life was not murder. It was a kind of housekeeping, a necessary step to protect the righteous and move history toward its ordained conclusion. The language was bloodless, almost administrative. That was its power. Lori absorbed these ideas quickly and deeply. Chad did more than validate her beliefs. He elevated her. He told her she was not an ordinary woman, not an ordinary mother. She was a translated being, someone whose spirit had lived multiple lives and carried authority from beyond the veil. This reframing was intoxicating. It transformed personal frustration into spiritual warfare and ordinary responsibility into a burden she was no longer meant to carry. In this worldview, resistance was not disagreement. It was evidence. Anyone who challenged Lori family members, former friends, even her own children could be reinterpreted as obstacles placed in her path by dark forces. The doctrine did not require her to wrestle with guilt or contradiction. It offered a clean solution, reassignment. Once someone was labeled dark, compassion was no longer required. Private messages later uncovered by investigators showed how thoroughly this thinking had taken hold. Conversations between Lori and Chad did not center on fear, uncertainty, or loss. They centered on spiritual status. Names were discussed alongside ratings, as though the people in their lives were entries on a list rather than human beings. The children were included in these discussions, not as children, but as problems already explained. JJ's needs, his autism, his reliance on routine, and reassurance were not treated as calls for care. They were reframed as signs of possession. His vulnerability became proof of darkness. Tylee's skepticism, her protectiveness toward her younger brother, her refusal to fully submit to Lori's new beliefs, these traits were not seen as normal adolescent resistance. They were interpreted as defiance against divine order. In this logic, love was conditional on compliance. As Lori and Chad grew closer, their certainty hardened. They spoke of a future together, one unencumbered by relationships that no longer fit their narrative. Practical matters, money, housing, public image were filtered through spiritual justification. Life insurance policies were discussed with the same detachment as prophecy. Death was not framed as an ending, but as a transition that conveniently resolved earthly complications. What made this phase especially insidious was how contained it was. There were no dramatic sermons broadcast to crowds, no fortified compounds. The radicalization happened in private spaces, text messages sent late at night, conversations framed as spiritual confidences, mutual reinforcement that left no room for outside correction. Extremism does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, repeating itself until it feels like common sense. Those on the outside sensed the shift but struggled to name it. Family members felt Lori slipping away, her tone flattening when asked about the children, her explanations becoming abstract and evasive. Concern was met with irritation. Questions were treated as attacks. The more people pressed, the more Lori withdrew into the certainty Chad provided. Within that closed loop, doubt became synonymous with evil. By this point, the disappearance of the children was no longer an unresolved crisis within Lori and Chad's shared reality. It was a completed chapter. Their conversations suggested relief rather than anxiety, anticipation rather than fear. They planned trips. They talked about starting fresh. There was no language of mourning, no acknowledgement of absence. The doctrine had replaced those emotions with purpose. This is where belief crossed a critical threshold. It stopped being a personal faith and became an operational system, one that dictated who mattered and who did not. Once blood ties were subordinated to spiritual rankings, there was no internal mechanism left to prevent harm. The doctrine did not ask whether something felt wrong. It asked only whether it aligned with prophecy. For the children, this shift was catastrophic. Their value was no longer inherent. It was conditional, revocable, subject to interpretation by two adults who believed themselves accountable to a higher law than any human one. In that framework, protection was not a duty. It was optional. Outside this sealed world, concern was beginning to coalesce into action. Relatives pushed harder. Authorities started asking more pointed questions. The gap between what Lori claimed and what could be verified widened. The doctrine could dismiss emotional appeals, but it could not indefinitely evade scrutiny. Still, at this stage, Lori and Chad remained confident. They believed they were ahead of the world, spiritually and strategically. They believed the most difficult decisions were behind them. What they underestimated was the weight of what they had replaced, how the absence of children would draw attention, how belief would falter under evidence, and how a system built to justify everything would ultimately justify nothing. The story could not remain sealed forever. What belief had insulated in private began to fracture under the pressure of absence, paperwork, and people who refused to let the missing become forgotten. The first cracks did not come from visions or prophecy, but from grandparents who knew something was wrong and would not be quiet about it. JJ's grandparents had lived close enough to Lori's life to recognize patterns. They knew his routines, his sensitivities, the cadence of his days. When calls went unanswered and weeks passed without proof that JJ was safe, concern hardened into alarm. They contacted authorities, not with certainty, but with a simple and devastating question: where is the child? When police began asking Lori directly, the answers came quickly and confidently and changed just as quickly. JJ was with a friend. JJ was being homeschooled. JJ was somewhere else, somewhere private. Each explanation collapsed under basic verification. Names could not be confirmed. Addresses led nowhere. The calmness with which Lori spoke stood in contrast to the seriousness of what she was being asked to explain. There was no visible fear that the lies might fail, only irritation that they were being questioned. As pressure increased, Lori did not produce her children. She produced distance. She avoided in-person meetings. She moved jurisdictions. She relied on the assumption that confidence could substitute for evidence. For a time, it worked. Missing child cases often begin this way, stalled by ambiguity and the hope that there is a benign explanation still waiting to be uncovered. But the story around Lori did not exist in isolation. Investigators began to notice a pattern of deaths and disappearances clustered around the same small group of people. Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, had died suddenly in her sleep. At first, it was treated as natural causes. But the timing raised questions. Chad had remarried quickly. Lori appeared not as a grieving widow's new partner, but as someone already established in Chad's life long before Tammy's death. As police revisited Tammy Daybell's case, the tone shifted. An exhumation was ordered. The death was re-examined. What had once seemed like coincidence began to look like design. Meanwhile, Lori was arrested not for murder, not yet, but for child abandonment. It was a narrow charge, but it carried weight. In court, she did not present the children. She did not explain their absence in any verifiable way. The belief system that had shielded her offered no protection here. The legal system did not recognize spiritual rankings or invisible transformations. It recognized custody, responsibility, and fact. Even then, Lori maintained her composure. She laughed with Chad during court appearances. She appeared unconcerned, even buoyant, as though the situation were temporary and easily misunderstood. To those watching, the emotional disconnect was startling. A mother whose children were missing did not behave like someone in crisis. She behaved like someone waiting for an inconvenience to pass. Investigators widened their focus. Phone records were examined. Text messages were recovered. Locations were mapped. The digital trail told a story that contradicted every public claim. It showed movements late at night, trips that had no benign explanation, and conversations that revealed foreknowledge discussions of outcomes before authorities had even raised questions. All roads began to lead back to one place, Chad Daybell's property in rural Idaho. In June 2020, investigators returned to that land with purpose. This was no longer a welfare check. It was a search informed by data, by patterns, by the quiet certainty that something had been deliberately hidden. Chad was watched closely as officers arrived. His reaction was immediate and telling. He did not ask why they were there. He did not appear confused. Instead, he left abruptly, driving away while the search was underway. What followed stripped away any remaining abstraction. Human remains were discovered buried on the property. One site held the body of J.J. Vallow, wrapped and bound, concealed with deliberate care. Nearby, another grave contained remains later identified as Tylee Ryan. The manner of burial spoke volumes. This was not an accident. This was not neglect. This was concealment. For investigators, the moment marked the end of uncertainty. For the families, it marked the beginning of a different kind of pain. Hope, however fragile, collapsed into grief. Questions shifted from where to how, and from how to why. The details were harrowing, but they were also clarifying. The children had not wandered off. They had not been placed with friends. They had been killed and buried on land owned by the man who claimed prophetic authority, the man Lori had trusted above all others. Chad was arrested that day. Lori was already in custody. The sealed world they had built could no longer protect them. The doctrine that had justified everything was powerless against physical evidence pulled from the ground. As the scope of the investigation expanded, the full extent of the deception came into view. Financial motives intertwined with spiritual ones. Benefits were collected. Deaths created convenience. The belief system did not replace practical incentive. It aligned with it. Faith and self-interest reinforced each other, creating a narrative in which elimination served both God and the future Lori and Chad imagined for themselves. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The calm language of prophecy was retranslated into the plain terms it had always disguised. Zombie became child. Transition became death. Mission became murder. The anger was not only about what had been done, but about how quietly it had been justified. Yet, amid the outrage, there was also mourning for the warning signs that had been missed, for how easily spiritual language can be weaponized, for how institutions built on trust can be exploited by certainty masquerading as faith. The graves on Chad Daybell's property were not just physical sites. They were the collapse point of a story that had relied on invisibility. Once the ground was disturbed, nothing remained hidden. The timeline could no longer be denied. The doctrine could no longer explain away reality. What lay ahead was no longer a search. It was a reckoning, one that would take place not in visions or predictions, but under oath, in a courtroom where belief would be measured against evidence and where the cost of blind faith would finally be counted. The final stage of the story unfolded without prophecy, without mysticism, and without the protective language that had once insulated Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell from consequence. In the courtroom, belief did not vanish, but it lost its authority. What remained were timelines, testimony, and the irreversible weight of what had been done. By the time the trials began, the narrative Lori and Chad had constructed for themselves had already collapsed. The remains of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were no longer abstractions or spiritual concepts. They were evidence. Photographs, forensic reports, and expert testimony replaced the euphemisms that had once allowed the defendants to speak about death without acknowledging it. The legal process did not argue with their beliefs. It simply ignored them. Lori was the first to face judgment. The court evaluated her not as a prophet or a chosen being, but as a mother with legal responsibility for two children who had been systematically removed from the world. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case showing how Lori lied repeatedly to family members, to friends, and to police. Each lie was small in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of deliberate concealment. Jurors heard how Lori continued to collect financial benefits after the children were dead, how she danced on a beach in Hawaii, smiling for wedding photographs, while grandparents pleaded for proof that JJ was alive. The contrast was unavoidable and devastating. This was not panic. This was not confusion. This was indifference sustained over time. Mental health evaluations became part of the proceedings, raising difficult questions about belief versus delusion, culpability versus conviction. But the court's focus remained narrow and precise. Whatever Lori believed, her actions had consequences. The law did not require her to understand reality in the same way as everyone else. It required her to be accountable for what she did within it. When the verdict came, it was unambiguous. Guilty. The sentence ensured Lori would spend the rest of her life in prison. There was no dramatic outburst, no visible reckoning. Her demeanor remained flat, detached, as if the outcome belonged to someone else. For many watching, that emotional absence was as unsettling as the crimes themselves. Chad Daybell's trial followed, and with it, a deeper examination of influence and intent. The prosecution portrayed Chad not as a passive believer swept along by Lori, but as an architect, someone who provided the framework that made everything else possible. His teachings, his classifications, his prophecies had not been idle speculation. They had been instructions. Witnesses described how Chad spoke about death in practical terms, how he predicted it, sometimes with chilling accuracy. The jury heard how Tammy Daybell's death had been quietly convenient, how Chad moved forward without visible grief, how life insurance and remarriage followed in swift succession. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence were reassembled into a coherent timeline. The defense attempted to portray Chad as eccentric, misguided, perhaps naive, but the evidence did not support innocence. It showed foreknowledge, coordination, and benefit. It showed a man who had used belief not only to explain events, but to shape them. When Chad was found guilty and sentenced to death, the courtroom absorbed the decision in silence. There was no triumph in it, no sense of closure that matched the scale of loss. Justice, in this context, did not feel like resolution. It felt like accounting. For the families of Tylee and JJ, the trials offered answers, but no relief. They learned details no one should have to know. They were asked to listen, to relive, to sit in rooms where their loved ones were reduced to exhibits. Their grief did not end with the verdicts. It simply changed shape. What lingers most powerfully in this case is not the spectacle of extremism, but its intimacy. This was not a distant cult or an isolated compound. It was a family, a set of private conversations, a belief system allowed to grow unchecked in the shadows of everyday life. It reminds us that the most dangerous ideas are not always loud or unfamiliar. Sometimes they sound like certainty. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in purpose. The story of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell forces an uncomfortable reckoning with how belief can erode responsibility when it is no longer anchored to empathy. It shows how easily language can be used to strip people of their humanity, how doctrine can transform children into obstacles, and how moral boundaries can disappear when replaced with perceived divine permission. There is no ending that restores what was taken. Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow do not return. What remains is their names, spoken now with clarity rather than confusion, and a record that refuses to let their disappearance be reframed as anything other than what it was. The trials close the legal chapter, but the question they leave behind is not legal at all. It is human. How many steps does it take to move from belief to harm? And how quietly can that distance be crossed? In this case, the answer is devastatingly clear. It did not happen all at once. It happened through trust misplaced, certainty unchallenged, and a willingness to believe that faith could excuse anything. By the time reality intervened, the cost had already been paid by those who had the least power to resist.